talk about the citizenship in India as well as in Europe. I have with me Harsh Mander. Harsh, as most of you might know, at least our Indian audience should know, is a social worker and writer. He works with survivors of mass violence, hunger, homeless, key persons, and street children. He's director for Center for Equity Studies and Special Commissioner to the Supreme Court of India in right to food cases. He is the founder of campaign Aman Biradari for secularism, peace, and justice. He is also founder of Nayagar for legal justice and reconciliation of survivors of communal violence, Dilse for street children, and Hausla for urban homeless people. He worked formally in Indian administrative service in Madhya Pradesh and Chhattisgarh for almost 2 decades, and as member of India's National Advisory Council from June 2010 to 12. He convened the working groups on Food Security Bill, Land Acquisition and Rehabilitation Bill, Child Labor Abolition, Manual Scavenging Abolition, Urban Poverty and Homelessness, Disability Rights, Bonded Labor, Street Vendors and Urban Slums, and co-convened the groups on the Communal and Targeted Violence Bill, Dalits and minorities, tribal rights, amongst others. So welcome, Harsh. That was a very long journey that you have as an experience behind yourself. Then we have Pamela Philipose. She is the public editor of The Wire. She is a former advisor to the media task force of the government of India's high-level status of women committee report. She began her career with the Times of India, and 2 decades later as senior associate editor with the Indian Express. She anchored its edit page. She has been honored with the Chameli Devi Jain Award for Outstanding Woman Journalist and Z. Astiwat Award for Constructive Journalism. Welcome, Pamela. And as the viewers might know, Wire.in is one of the leading papers in India for the left ecosystem. Now, we also have Indrajit Roy. Indrajit worked in the development sector for 7 years prior to undertaking his doctoral studies at the University of Oxford. Since obtaining the doctorate in development studies, he has held the ESRC Future Research Leader Fellowship at Oxford Department of International Development, as well as Junior Research Fellowship at Wolfson College at University of Oxford. His research and teaching contribute to critical approaches to studying the politics of global development with a focus on new development futures that promise to reframe the discipline. Accredited as Fellow of the Higher Education Academy, Indrajit has innovated teaching and curriculum design over the last several years of his academic life. He won a Teaching Excellence Award at the University of Oxford in 2016, and since joining University of York in 2017, he is working with colleagues to diversify and decolonize the department curriculum. Welcome, Indrajit. Indrajit, I would now hand it over to you for taking this discussion forward. I know I'm also one of your speakers, but perhaps people have been seeing enough of me and know enough of me so far. So over to you, Indrajit.
Thank you, Ritu. I mean, commendable job wearing so many hats and, doing such a fine job. So thank you so much. Thank you also to you and your colleagues for organizing this wonderful event. So I think for everyone who's joining us, the conversations on this panel are motivated by contentions over the Citizenship Amendment Act, which was passed by the Indian Parliament back in December 2019. The implementation of these amendments threatened to spawn the world's largest ever crisis of citizenship and statelessness. However, they have been vigorously protested by several sections across Indian society. Now, what do these contests over citizenship mean for the politics of statelessness, citizenship, and democracy? Supporters of the amendments have argued that the amendment is democratic insofar as they were passed through parliament, where the government, the BJP government and its allies enjoy a majority since Prime Minister Modi's thumping re-election in May 2019. Critics have argued that the amendments violate constitutional provisions, especially of secularism, but also violate broad principles of social justice. So our contributors today will reflect on the contests over citizenship in India. Of course, there'll be a global inflection as well, as we will see. But the focus will be on three interrelated questions. The first question that we will want to sort of pick up is what the implications of the amendments of India's citizenship laws are on the country's 1.3 billion people. While Muslims suspect that they will be willfully omitted from the register, and they have enough reason for such suspicion, members of historically oppressed communities such as Dalits and Adivasis, who, by the way, number almost 300 million people, so that's about the entire population of the United States, as well as the 100 million odd migrant workers and other poor people, feel that they will be unable to provide the necessary documentation. So, how are different social groups likely to be affected by the amendment to India's citizenship laws? The second question we will be sort of reflecting on are the implications of the protests for democracy in India. The protests saw Hindus and Muslims unite on the streets, like few other events in the past. What narratives bound them together, and how were these fragmented? What do these trends foretell for democratic citizenship in India? And the third broad issue that we will be covering relate to the global implications of India's contests over citizenship. After all, it can be argued that all forms of citizenship entail forms of exclusion. Nations have used citizenship throughout human history to exclude groups of people on the basis of identity, whether it's race or religion or something else. So, what does the impending crisis of citizenship in India show us? Is this the future of citizenship across the world? These are some of the issues we hope to discuss in the panel today. Um, so, as a sort of prelude, could I request each of our panelists to tell us in under a minute, please, because time is of the essence, what they mean by citizenship? For example, for me, citizenship entails, at the very least, a formal set of rights, which is then overlaid by a more substantive access to social, economic, and political resources. So I'd like each of our colleagues to perhaps tell us a bit about what they mean by citizenship before we really get to the heart of the conversations. So Pamela, if I could invite you to reflect on citizenship in under a minute, please.
Basically, I'd like to actually stick to the constitutional definition of citizenship. And when the constitution came into force in India in 1950, it kind of told you that anyone who was born in the country had right to Indian citizenship. So that was the baseline, that anyone who was born in this country or either of whose parents were born in the territory of India was an Indian citizen. This, of course, ties up to the preamble because such a person will be able to access justice, liberty, equality, fraternity, as well as guarantees like freedom of expression, freedom of association, freedom from hunger, tangentially through the right to life. Also to be noted, there was no religious discrimination in such a definition. This was to change, and and this change is what we should be concerned about in our discussion. But citizens also share common symbols, values, memories, myths, traditions. We know Benedict Anderson's, concept of an imagined community. How these came to be defined can create both bridges and barriers between citizens. A sense of origin, blood, and belief was central to the Savarkarite. Veer Savarkar, as many of you may know, was the founding figure behind the Hindutva concept. And for him, origin, blood, and belief was central to his idea of citizenship. In contrast, what is striking about the original constitutional notion of citizenship was that religion could not be the basis of arriving at an understanding of who is the Indian citizen. I will stop here because there have been changes in this idea of citizenship, which we will discuss as we go forward.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Pamela. But I think the broader idea of the sense of belonging, a substantive sense of belonging that citizenship entails is useful for us to keep in mind. So thank you for mentioning that.
So for me, citizenship is rather a privilege, and I think Dimitry will be a good person to actually elaborate upon it as well, because I have a similar opinion as Dimitry on the nature of citizenship, and I can take you back in the historic times as well, where citizenship was a privilege bestowed upon certain groups of people, usually men, and then expanding it further to what we have come to know today as a right to citizenship, which again is bestowed upon certain groups of people and by just our nature of our birth. Yeah, and there are so many million people, I think 1 million in Europe itself, which are stateless without a citizenship. And now we also see the similar situation in Assam, where people are born without the citizenship. So in some ways, it is just a legal box ticking exercise of bestowing people right by creating another layer of legality upon their births. So, yes.
Thank you, Ritu. I think this your intervention about citizenship being a basis of exclusion, as it were, is, I think, a very useful sort of dark side, as it were, to the idea of citizenship. And I suppose, like any concept in political science or political theory, or in the social sciences for that matter, there is an inclusionary element to citizenship in terms of those who have rights and those who belong, and an exclusionary element to it. Obviously, if for someone to have rights, there's a dimension that somebody will not have those rights. For someone to belong in the in-group, there has to be someone who's sort of excluded. And I think this tension in the concept has profound implications for the lives of millions of people across the world. So I think in terms of having laid out the understandings of citizenship and come up with or got a sense of how citizenship is defined by our panelists, if I could move on to thinking about the Citizenship Amendment Act a little more and invite reflections on the act itself, what it was, why there were protests against it, and what were the similarities and differences across the protests. I think that'll be useful. One way to, I guess, think about going forward would be, Pamela, in case you had any thoughts on if you wanted to tell us a bit about the CAA, perhaps, and why it was introduced, and then we can take it up from there.
We know that the Citizenship Amendment Bill was first introduced by the Modi government in 2016 in their first term. The BJP at this point had harbored anxieties that it could have a potential adverse impact on the 2019 election. So although it was passed in the Lok Sabha, they didn't really push it beyond that. But once they came back in 2019, like many speakers, I think Indrajit, you referred to, and also Ritu, once they returned to power in 2019 with an increase in 21 seats, it felt it had the necessary political capital and organizational capacity to embark on its blatantly majoritarian agenda and manage the contradictions that may accrue. So you see, it is a considered and calibrated move in that sense. The year 2019, let us remember, began with the communalized electioneering of the 2019 general election, which had weaponized the Pulwama attack and the Balakot strike. Narendra Modi's poll speeches fuse the masculinist, what is known as the Mard Sarkar, and the militaristic, can your vote be dedicated to the brave soldiers martyred in Pulwama, he asked time and again, tropes, with the majoritarian trope. The revocation of Article 370 in Kashmir, changing the status of Kashmir, 3 months after the general election victory, was an apotheosis of the Pulwama Balakot rhetoric. In a sense, it was a fulfillment of that. The congratulatory sentiment the move evoked among so many, in utter disregard to the human tragedy unfolding in Kashmir, was driven by the sentiment that the piece of land crowning India's map was now firmly secured, even as India's only Muslim majority state was wiped off it. So it was a twin mobilization in that sense. Land, 1,500 square yards of it, was also central to the mosque temple Supreme Court verdict of November 9th. So in August, you had the reading down of Article 370. By November, you had the Supreme Court verdict, which handed over the land on which the Babri Masjid had once stood, and to the Hindu party. Now, when I say Hindu party, I don't say Hindus. I said the Hindu party in that. It's important because I think we need to make a distinction between the larger Hindu community and the Hindu party that was, working towards acquiring this. Yeah. While passing the Citizenship Amendment Act into law in December 2019, the long-term plan of the government was also made clear. The new law, and I wish Harsh was here because he was the one who actually worked very hard to make this known to so many people. I remember attending many seminars he organized at that point, including public hearings. So basically the mapping that they did at that point was to bring in the All India National Register of Citizenship. That was NRC, which was supposed to be like the Assam NRC that Ritu just talked about. Basically, and the updating of the National Population Register, which was basically data collection. So this was the architecture. You had the CAA, you had the NRC, and you had the NPR, and together they formed the larger, picture.
Yeah.
I don't know, Indrajit, if we have time, but if the two anti-car protests broke out instantaneously and simultaneously. In Northeast India, we saw a protest driven by anxiety that the region would be swamped by immigrants threatening its demographic identities.
Yeah.
But for the rest of the country, the large protests that broke out in Uttar Pradesh, Delhi, West Bengal, Karnataka, Maharashtra, were against its anti-constitutional, anti-Muslim character. For the first time in the 5.5 years of BJP rule, the slow fire of an unarticulated despair and powerlessness among common people, especially Muslims, in the face of a repressive, arrogant, and blatantly majoritarian government, burst into a resolute resistance. The move, along with the proposed PR and NRC, was rightly recognized as a way to ensure permanence to a project designed to ensure that the Muslims of India, who numbered 200 million, were to be rendered second-class citizens.
I find it very unsettling that we are talking on citizenship, which is one of the key issues raised by the European Parliament on India. And maybe, Alina, you can step in to tell about the European Parliament, how they have come after India on the aspect of citizenship, while I connect to Harsh.
Sure. So let's see. Without any preparation, I'm going to attempt to jump in here So let me see, here we go. So the European Union deeply respects the idea of letting internal matters be internal matters. And that means that the struggle to get any type of recognition for the plight of those protesting against the Citizenship Amendment Act in India has been rather intense, to put it that way. There were several plans to table resolutions in the European Parliament, and they did take up speed. So as far as I remember, the European Parliament is divided into several groups of parties from each member state that are somewhat aligned with each other. So there's the Conservative bloc, there's the Liberal bloc, there's the Green bloc, and all of them, apart from the far, far right one, I think, they all prepared resolutions about the CAA expressing their disapproval of the act or of the act and the way that the government responded to protests, or one of them. I hear an echo of myself.
No, it's okay.
It's gone. And one of the groups actually only criticized how the government responded to the protesters, not the act itself, but they all prepared documents and put them forward separately in their groups to say the way that citizenship is based on religion is not okay. However, there was no big response from domestic parliaments, and ultimately, as far as I'm aware, most of these little groups, they faced severe opposition from lobby groups affiliated with India, South Asian NGOs, diplomatic ties, who said that passing such a resolution would not end well or would not be in the favor of respecting national sovereignty and internal affairs, which the European Union indeed does say it respects.
Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot, Aruna. Over to you, Indrajit. I think Harsh is able to join in as well, and we should continue the discussion as far as we can.
So are we okay? Can you hear me now?
Yes, I think everyone can hear you now, Harsh. I think this is much better.
And so friends, and my very sincere apologies. I don't know what was the problems technically. Without taking too much time, I did want to put a perspective here. We can get into the technicalities of the questions, but there's a much deeper debate, which is very important for India, but it's also important for people around the world. And that is really about the same question of belonging. Who and on what terms can you belong, and who does not belong, and who decides the question of belonging. And I think that the idea of India as imagined during the freedom struggle led by Mahatma Gandhi, and then later written into the Constitution, was that India would be a humane and inclusive country with extremely diverse populations, diversity of faith, diversity of language, almost unparalleled anywhere among countries around the world, and would be comfortable with that diversity, and that everybody who chooses to make this country theirs would belong equally. And I think that was central to this idea, but it was opposed by the Hindu supremacist groups along these 100 years, and the CA laws really is a culmination of this 100-year battle for us to really understand its implications, because they were in fact in their early writings very frankly admiring of Hitler and the imagination of a pure race. Here, the purity was based on religious belief above all, and so the idea was really, the alternative idea was this would be a country of Hindus in which Muslims and Christians who are seen as people who have, their religious beliefs go beyond the nation state. And they would therefore be lesser citizens, the second-class citizens. They would live in India only, in a sense, if they are allowed to buy the Hindu majority to whom the country actually belongs. And this was a second idea. The third idea was of the Muslim League, which in a sense echoes this, said that India is not one but two countries, Hindu India and a Muslim Pakistan. And as we know, they finally, we had partition, million people died. We had the largest displacement in human history. My own family was among the people displaced. And it remained, and Mahatma Gandhi, actually his last battle was precisely on this question, because many people said that now that there is a Muslim Pakistan, India should be a country, a natural land for the Hindus. And it was his opposition to this idea which actually finally led to his assassination by Hindu supremacist groups. And this battle has continued almost, since independence. And I think that this idea that the citizenship laws for the first time have actually made a distinction between a right of access based on your religious identity. It is something that stirred up the nation. I had feared that this problem could only be solved in a spirit of solidarity, of us coming together. But the Hindus and Muslims fought jointly against this law which discriminated against Muslims. And that is what really happened spontaneously. Students in universities across the country, and then groups for 100 glorious days actually fought against the idea of an India and exclusively owned and for Hindus, and that Hindus in very large numbers joined this battle for an inclusive and humane nation was, I think, the critical question. And not taking up more time, it's really a question important not just for India but for people around the world, because I think more and more, your neighbor is likely to look differently from you, worship differently from you, eat and dress differently from you. How do you relate to this person? And I think the idea of being comfortable completely with diversity, there are no conditions for you to belong except an adherence to the values of the Constitution, to justice, liberty, equality, fraternity. Can we build an alternative idea of living together and belonging? That is really, I think, the question and debate that we are having in India, and for the world, I think it is also important.
Thanks a lot, Harsh. Indrajit.
Thank you. No, I think that's very useful to, I suppose, just to, get our heads in. It wasn't a legislation introduced overnight. It's part of a much longer set of ideas about what India should look like. And Pamela, talked about the way in which the government tried to bring about this legislation back in 2016, but didn't push through. And of course, Harsh, you tell us, about the very long drawn antecedents of this idea. I mean, I think the reason the amendment really took everyone by shock was because under its provisions, members of religious groups were named as people who would find their applications for citizenship fast-tracked, and Muslims were explicitly omitted from that legislation. So I think the religious filter that it introduced, as you and before you, Pamela, was telling us, really struck at the heart of the secular principles of the Constitution. We heard a bit from Pamela about why Indians sort of protested so vigorously against the CAA. So I'll sort of maybe now bring Ritu, if I could request you to tell us a bit about the ways in which these protests played out in Assam. Pamela did mention a bit about how the protests in Assam were different. Assam and the Northeast more broadly were different from the protests elsewhere in India. So Ritu, if you could sort of just reflect a bit on that, that'll be helpful. We can't hear you, I think. Yeah.
Definitely, Indrajit. As we have seen in the past that the citizenship debate itself has been at the crux, at the heart of the politics in Assam, and we have seen that how the entire political life of Assam from 1970s onwards got shaped. In fact, even before that, got shaped by the idea and the sense of belonging. So obviously, when the Citizenship Act came, it not just it came on the idea that, okay, what NRC we have implemented, or the National Registration of Citizenship we have implemented in Assam, let's carry it forward to the entire country. And on top of it, let's also determine that, with the Citizenship Act, we determine basically based on a religious identity that who belongs to the country of India and who doesn't. However, in Assam, the problem has in the past been a racial problem, or rather an ethnical problem, and not so much to do with the religion. So whereas the entire country in India protested on the grounds of religion, for Assam, it was a mixture of wanting to have an NRC, but at the same time not being wanted to divide it or have a wedge with its own religious communities there, which were also religiously perhaps Assamese and all. And I am in some ways very critical of the Assam position, because I have always sort of argued that the ethno-nationalism in Assam has led to the situation where, you have NRC and 1.9 million people getting finding themselves into a statelessness register, and mostly because they lack documentation than anything else, and we can go on arguing about it. But this reframing of the citizenship based on the idea of religion was something which was not earlier seen in Assam, but with this Citizenship Amendment Act that came to make another wedge in the landscape, or the political landscape of the state. So over to you, Indrajit.
Thanks. I think it's really critical for us to bear in mind that the protests were not uniform, and we've often tended to paint the protests in with the same brush, and that there were these important differences. We may agree with the spirit of the protesters in Assam, or we may disagree with them, but I think it's really important to understand the ways in which they were different from the motivations elsewhere. Pamela, you were telling us a bit about earlier, you were telling us about the protests in India more broadly, and the way in which the country erupted. Very quickly, why do you think the people protested so vigorously? We've had lots of very, very odd, to put it very politely, sorts of policies, by the government. What was different this time? Why did people protest so vigorously?
Basically, I think there was the build-up that we saw over the last few months, but that build-up also had the unintended consequence of bringing people together in strange ways, and it's very interesting that hijab-clad women waving the tricolor and coming out on the streets for days together, when seemingly non-political students from elite institutions like IIT raised their voices, along with their counterparts from Jamia Millia and Aligarh University, when ordinary peace-abiding and people gathered to protest and read out from the preamble with forgotten words like secularism, democratic, socialism, justice, liberty, and so on. It was forgotten. I'm telling you, these words had to be revived in many ways after about 3 or 4 years of this hardline government. It was hard to miss the new fraternity. What was particularly striking was the figure of a hitherto missing person from public protest, the Muslim woman. And that, I think, is very significant, because it is that voice that was unique. And why did a Muslim woman come out in the way she did? Many, and I spoke to some of them, they said, we're doing it for our future, so that our children, we are sitting under these tarpaulins, but I don't want my children to be in a detention camp. And that's why we are doing it. And so they sat with their babes in our arms and so on. But what it did to family dynamics is also an interesting, sort of subtext of this, in the sense that it did change the patriarchal nature of the family within the Muslim household. So it had unintended consequences. And of course, there's this wonderful woman, called Bilqis Dadi, who got recognized as an inspirational figure around the world.
No, I think, we saw that, and they were really inspiring stories, I think, not only from Shaheen Bagh in Delhi, but from all across the country. Anirudh, our colleague, has a question. Do you want to go ahead, Anirudh?
Yeah, I'm Anubandh, but it's okay. No, I think
Anubandh, sorry.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
I was very surprised, because when I saw the anti-CA protests erupted, because we have seen in the first 5 years of the Modi mandate, or 5 years, we saw demonetization, we saw lynchings, we saw many social unrest, problems, but we did not see the social unrest. We did not see mass movements, and I was surprised also, because with the anti-CA movements, it was not just the small group of liberals or intellectuals who dared to be supportive of the Muslims, but it was common people who started to stand together, So I somehow tried to me, it makes a correlation with the civil disobedience movement, of that sort. And then we also saw the farmers movement now. So somehow the fear is going away, And we have also seen this in Myanmar, where this after the military's coup, or we see that people are going back to civil disobedience. So, but how do you see now, let's say after COVID, how people will now, if they will come back, if they will dare to stand with the Muslims again, let's say, because we also had the Delhi riots, So please, if you have any take on this.
That's a great question, and it's very difficult to predict. But I did want to underline that when the CA law was passed in Parliament, the date was being debated. I could not have dreamt that there would be a nationwide, the largest movement of non-violent civil disobedience movement that the country has seen since independence, with Hindus and Muslims coming together across the country. I believe that we had seen a whole 5 years of silence and 5 years plus of silence, where we watched India changing in very, very basic ways. The lynchings that started happening across the country, largely targeting Muslims, actually had very close parallels with the lynchings in America over 60 years from the late 19th century. It was really extremely cruel attacks targeting people actually for who they are, rather than for what, and the kind of cruelty that happened. People would videotape it and circulate it triumphantly. And there was a silence. There was almost a kind of acceptance while all of this happened. And that really troubled and worried me, and many like us. So we had made an appeal. We started what we called Karwane Mohabbat, which was a really caravan of love, and we said that to counter the politics of hate, one has to find a different idiom of resistance, and we started a caravan of love. Went around the country to families which were affected by lynching, etc. But it seemed very lonely, very isolated, and therefore, when the anti-CA protest, when the CA, the law got passed in Parliament, I had expected there would be just lonely voices of protest again, and I had put out I wrote an article and op-ed saying that. Learning from civil disobedience from Mahatma Gandhi, my civil disobedience would be to if you're going to make a discrimination on the basis of religion, I will in official records register myself as Muslim and then refuse to give my documents and demand that I be deprived of my citizenship as my brothers and sisters are. But it was when this broke out across the country, I think what we need to understand was not just that they fought against. It wasn't against a 1,000-word law. It was about that idea of India, that who does this country belong to, and that people came out in such large numbers. I was traveling virtually every day across the country, invited to speak, sometimes to 100,000 people or more. And watching the kind of display of solidarity, that you cannot fight hate with hate, you have to fight hate with love, and that people understood it. And the icons of this protest became the Constitution of India, the national flag, all of which reflected pluralism. And in protest after protest, it would always end with a reading of the preamble, where justice, liberty, equality, fraternity, equally for all. It was a very people understood that this was part of that 100-year battle. It was about the kind of country that we need to give to our children, and whether it should be humane and inclusive, or one that is based on inequality, hatred, and unequal citizenship. Excluding people on the basis of religion. And I think that the protest, many people think were failed, they got crushed because of Corona and so on. I think the very fact that we came out together in the largest movement of Hindu-Muslim and demonstration of Hindu-Muslim unity since Mahatma Gandhi's assassination was itself a victory. The farmers' protest again display exactly the same kind of solidarity. And so I think that people are recognizing that, we have to claim and fight for and struggle for this idea of equal citizenship. And people who are not being discriminated have a very high duty to stand with those who are being discriminated and to demand equal citizenship for all.
Thanks a lot, Harsh. In fact, indeed, that is really heartening to hear from you on the if I may add that we also, like outside of India, we all went out to do protests, and we have been acting in the activist scope since then, actually. And it was really heartening for us as well to, just go out and meet our fellow protesters and beyond the religious binaries and beyond the race and class binaries. So it was really a moment for not just the people living in India, but also outside of India, that it brought us a sense of solidarity here as well. So Indrajit, over to you.
I think Rudabe has a question. Go for it, Rudabe.
Hi, thanks for having me here. Jit's colleague at the University of York, and I'm a postdoctoral fellow here, and I'm also at the Atlantic Council in the US, where I'm a non-resident senior fellow. We're talking about the effects of this and how it might have led to it, and how the CAA protests are in many ways a show of solidarity. But I was wondering, the people who came up with these amendments to the Constitution, what what is the end goal? I mean, that is something that I have been looking in my research, and sometimes I have had discussions with Ritu as well. I mean, let me give you a couple examples from, countries around the region. So a very, let's put it this way. A country, for example, which has kind of like a racial balance, a very delicate balance, is Malaysia, where the Bhumiputra word is in official use. So it's basically giving the Malay majority some kind of an affirmative action, certain benefits. And everybody knows, there's also the Chinese and the Indians who are there. They're not Bhumiputra. The Malay population is. If we move to Burma, as we saw with the Rohingyas, there was the 135 original race theory, and certain racial groups did not make it there. And the Rohingyas, what happened to them? They went through genocide. On the other hand, there's China with the Uyghurs. From what I know is that if a Uyghur tries to leave China, even that's not accepted. I mean, some of them have fled to neighboring countries, for example, to Turkey, because they share linguistic ties. And the Chinese government demanded them back. I mean, they said that, no, these are our citizens and we're going to retrain them to become Chinese. So what is actually happening? I mean, it doesn't seem like, so basically my question is that it's not like it's uniform all over India as well. I mean, it seems like the Assamese nationalists want to push out people. There's also the Ghar Wapsi issue in, certain parts of India. And then there are also lynchings going on. And of course, the CAA, it legalizes a lot of things. And then, the NRC, which we have already talked about, if it is implemented, rolled out to the rest of India, that would single out a certain religious group. So, my whole question is basically, where is this headed?
If I can quickly say something, Indrajit, before for you to have a more complex intervention. So I think when we look at the history and also the narrative of Hindutva, especially coming from that guy Savarkar, he himself said that, Muslims can live in India, but their position should be the same as how it was of the Negroes in a slave society of America. So in some ways, it's looking at the human beings in a very neoliberal ownership fashion, which might pretty much be behind the ideology of what Hindutva groups have been building up towards now. But I'm pretty sure Indrajit, Pamela, and Harsh will have much more sophisticated answers to this question of yours, Ritumbra, so I'll let them handle it now.
Yes.
I think that where they're trying to head is pretty clear. That is why I kept emphasizing this 100-year battle. It is to actually build India into a very different country from that which was imagined and promised in the Constitution. And it would be an India of Hindu supremacism. It would be an India where India is seen as, like Israel is, as the natural home of Hindus. And not of people of the Muslims and Christians. It would be an India of unequal citizenship. The NRC process is actually extraordinary because it turns the burden of proof. It's not on the burden of proof is not on the state to prove that you are an illegal citizen. It is on every person to produce documents which I would find it very difficult to, which date back, 70, 80 years, to show your family tree, to show that you actually, your ancestors belong to this country, and so on. But through the CAA, they also wanted to create an escape path. So if Hindus, as happened in Assam, are not able to produce their documentation, prove their citizenship with these documents, we will treat you as a persecuted minority from neighboring countries, and we will give give you citizenship, but this will not be available to Muslims who are undocumented. And so it is a simple answer is actually to create a Hindu Pakistan, a Hindu sort of Zia Pakistan, and it's very different. It's really to transform India at a very fundamental level. That really was the objective.
If I could add to that, and I think it's a fascinating question, because it always leaves you wondering what are people up to, what's the agenda, so to speak. One of the obvious questions that anyone could ask about the entire CAA and NRC process is, okay, if you've identified X million number of people to be non-citizens, let's say, what do you do to them? And there is the entire plan of detention centers, about which I would like Harsh to tell us a little more, because the condition of detention centers is horrible. But okay, you send, you have your various sort of processes, and you've identified people as foreigners. What do you do with them? Because India does not have deportation agreements with the countries who it would like to deport them to. And of course, here I'm looking at you, Ritumbra, in the sense, there is the obvious target for a lot of this is the Bengali Muslims, so to speak. And the idea is that they are illegal immigrants from Bangladesh. But of course, there is no deportation agreement that India has with Bangladesh. So the question is, what do you do? What do you do with these 200 million people or X million people who you would like not to give citizenship to? But of course, they're sort of not, you don't have legal arrangements with any country in place to deport. And I think it's something that Ritu touched upon, and it's something that Harsh has also mentioned. And I would tend to agree with this whole idea that it's likely not a process of physical expulsion of any community from India. And in that respect, I suppose the right-wing apologists are correct. They're not seeking to expel anyone from India, or perhaps not even seeking to annihilate or liquidate anyone physically. I mean, if people are lynched, that's they will make up words for it to say how sad and sorry, or not, sometimes not even that they are. But I think it is about this graded citizenship. There is an unequal citizenship that's at play. It's something that Savarkar did refer to. He was perfectly happy with what he called a Hindu nation and a Muslim nation. He was quite happy for a Hindu nation to have its own flag and a Muslim nation to have its own flag, as long as it was clear who's the boss, meaning, that it is the Hindu sort of supremacist. And I think that's a term that was used. There is a project of a Hindu ethnocracy, if you will, being constructed in India. By ethnocracy, I mean the entire sort of project of an undifferentiated Hindu community. And for that reason, the RSS and the Hindu right-wing ecosystem, we talk about them being Brahmanical and so on. And of course they are, but then they do have an idea of an undifferentiated Hindu community. But of course, every inclusion requires an exclusion, as I think Ritu pointed out, right in the beginning. And who's going to be excluded from that sort of, undifferentiated Hindu community? It is the Muslim. So I think what you are seeing is a Hindu Rashtra, which is not so much only Hindus and everyone else leave. It's much more about, well, it's only Hindus and everyone else, or the Muslim certainly is a second-class citizen. Comparisons are often made with the Israeli situation. And I think the term ethnocracy itself has been used to describe Israel. Remember that, the entire circumstances under which Israel comes into being. Of course, there's lots of questions around that. But there is the sense that Israel is a land of the Jews, just like India is a land of the Hindus. That's the sort of sense that is being promoted. The comparison with Malaysia is interesting, but there is a very obvious difference in the sense that the Malays were, if you looked at economic indicators, etc., the Malays were worse off than the other communities. You can't say that about the Hindus in India, and especially when you consider the Muslims. The Muslims in terms of economic and social indicators are at the bottom of the heap anyway. So I think what you have is the project of Hindu ethnocracy, which is cementing existing hierarchies, creating new hierarchies as well, but also cementing the hierarchy between the Hindu and the Muslim, and making it clear that it's the Hindu that sits atop the Muslim. It's not a very sophisticated answer to your question, but I think this is more or less the direction I would think we are headed towards.
I can add a little bit to it. I also sometimes have this sense that, and going from the ethnocracy project of Hindutva, which we have come to see in the recent years, that this is not just within India, but also outside of India, the way the Hindutva and Hinduness has been pushed in the last certain years with the yoga schools and also with International Yoga Day, perhaps, more than anything else. It is also that collectiveness or that identity as a Hindu nation, as a Hindu grouping, to the exclusion of everything else, that is also somewhat reflective of where perhaps this is headed, that we want to, India or Indianness want to assert this identity based on a religion and pitch itself pretty much what Samuel Huntington said, the clash of the civilization. So whereas you have Muslims and Christians clashing for the civilization, now you also have this Hindu entity which has inserted itself onto the world stage, I think. And yeah, I wonder what you think about it, Indrajit and Pamela.
Yeah, I mean, Pamela, we haven't heard from you. Sorry, we sort of, took the conversation, but I'm also aware that Anubandh had a question earlier for you, which, maybe you wanted to respond to. So over to you, Pamela.
No, I think there is a bit of victimhood. The victim card is always played in the joke. I think it, even in this majoritarian project, the idea that Hindus have been victimized is also very current and very present. And therefore, people can understand and feel that they have been discriminated against by, that's why the constant appeal, constant reference to the Mughal and the Muslim intruder, conqueror, and so on. So the victim card is very much in part of this. But what is very interesting is the way the Bangladeshi, immigrant, or they termed it the intruder, the Bangladeshi intruder. They used military jargon in terms of infiltrator. That card was used for many years. And then suddenly, like a card trick, that card was reversed, because you're quite right. They won't want to, in fact, they want to be happy, they want to cultivate good relations with Bangladesh. So they will not push that. They will not try and, expel people, although they can do it to the Rohingya, because Rohingya, they know, are anyway people who will not be considered, they are already a stateless people, but they can't do it to Bangladesh in the same way. And therefore, they will try and, translate that Bangladesh infiltrator to the Muslim person. That is the person they have. That's the person of interest for them, you see. So it's the use of this that is very, very, and it's very, very nuanced and cynical, the way they have worked on this narrative over a period of time.
Thanks, Pamela. There was also a question that Anubandh had asked earlier. Anubandh, do you want to remind us in a sentence what that question was? Because I'm aware that Harsh responded, but we didn't give Pamela a chance. So Anubandh, go for it.
Right. I'm sure she remembers it. It was in the light of the anti-CA protest.
Excellent question, Anubandh. Thank you so much. Basically, I think the instinct to speak out has been unleashed. I think what has happened is the anti-CA, sort of protests had actually opened the Pandora's box in many ways. And what you see in the farm struggle, for instance, is a similar kind. It's amazing how, again, the farmers have always emphasized they are one people. They don't want divisions of religion and others. They may be predominantly from the Sikh community, but they are reaching out to everyone who sees their problem, you see. And so there is that concept of, the constitutional India fighting back in many ways for their rights, for their right to have rights. And that's what I think is very important. And I think the anti-CAA struggle has been central to this. We may not have had the farmers' struggle to the extent that we've seen it, and that's a historic one. In fact, it's seen as an internationally important, sort of resistance. But we wouldn't have had it without the anti-CAA.
Yeah, if I may add just one line to it. I think there was an interesting observation 4 or 5 years by Yogendra Yadav, and I remember he said, the farmers as a political constituency, their number is shrinking because of, the problem the sector has, and he realized and he voiced it, saying that farmers should start agitating before their numbers shrink to a level and they don't become relevant, and they have to do this. So I find it, I'm not saying he alone did all that, but he played a role. And I think we have to recognize this, because there is a theory about something and then there is a things in practice, I see, at least in this case, we see both being well planned and executed. And I'm glad it really made it happen,
Thanks. I'm aware that we're sort of cruising to the end of the session, but I did want to bring Harsh in on one issue, which, in all our debates on citizenship tends to get left out, and that's the human cost of it all. Especially the entire idea of putting people into detention centers, having people appear before foreigners' tribunals, the uncertainties caused by the documentation, the lack of documentation, or approvals not being given to documentation. Harsh, if you're with us still, could you reflect a bit on the human costs of this all? And what, based on your interviews and based on your work with colleagues in Assam and elsewhere, what have been the human costs of what has already been unleashed in the name of the CAA?
I'm so glad that that we are ending with this, because it's not something just about, your paper which gives you citizenship or which denies you citizenship. It's about placing an entire community based on the accident of their birth into a particular religious group, and in Assam also into a language group of Bengali speakers, into a near permanent state of insecurity and fear, because this, they spent the last 10 to 15 years collecting documents which are so complex. As I said, if you ask me, each of my grandparents and my great-grandparents, siblings' names, dates of birth, and documents to prove that they were siblings and so on and so forth, it would be impossible for me to do it. And this is what people were asked to accomplish. Very, very poor people, largely, many of them migrant workers, many of them cultivators on islands, river islands which get eroded. Within all of this, running after lawyers, going into very, very hostile bureaucratic procedures, the kind of open discrimination that they experience, and the threat of the detention center, most of all. I would speak a little bit about the detention center because I was invited by the National Human Rights Commission to be the special monitor on minorities, and I said the first thing I want to do is to enter those detention centers because no non-official has been allowed to enter. And with great difficulty, I did, and they were places close to hell. I mean, international law is very clear that when, if somebody is unable to prove their documentation for citizenship, you can, lock them up maybe for 3 months, maximum 6 months, but not indefinitely. You don't separate families, you don't keep them in jails. But this is precisely what they did. They kept them in, there were jails within jails, families were separated, and as Indrajit said, there was no question of them ever going to Bangladesh because they were not even negotiating that. And so they were effectively in prison for the rest of their lives, separated from each other, living in really hellish conditions. And I wrote a report about that. The Human Rights Commission refused to act on it, so I resigned and went to the Supreme Court and said, you can't allow this to happen. But it is this, there are a few thousand people in the detention centers, but it was this fear that this can happen to you. And people committed suicide. We visited families where, your loved one is in a detention center and there's no chance of him coming out. You've spent everything, you've sold whatever you have on lawyers who've not been able to get her or him out. And people then commit suicide, families are left distraught. It is this that we saw happening in Assam. And recently, the BJP election a couple of days ago has left the Bengali Muslim community, they say that the future is going to be calamitous because they will come after us. It's going to be a Rohingya-like situation. And when they're going to do this all over the country, the purpose is very clear. I mean, 200 million people cannot be expelled from this country. But 200 million people can be placed in a situation where they're in continuous fear about their citizenship and their basic right to live with dignity and equality in this country being continuously threatened. And that is really, I think, the objective and where we are seeing India going.
Thanks a lot, Harsh, for that. And if I may add, actually, we also, some of you have known this as well, that I worked with the D-voters in Assam, and we were able to visually show that the entire D-voter list, every single name in the D-voter list was basically from the Brahmaputra Valley, the areas which get really, really deeply flooded. And we did share this information also with the European Parliament. So it is indeed a question of documentation rather than their actual belonging. The ability to not prove that they are a citizenship lies at the heart of the Assam problem. Over to you, Indrajit.
No, I mean, that is a very sobering note to on which I think we should end. And so I would like to, I think if I have your permission, Ritu, I would like to thank everyone for joining us here. Some of us are really elated with news from West Bengal about the BJP's decisive loss. But we are also aware that it may be a decisive win for the TMC this time round, the state government led by Mamata Banerjee. But the BJP has increased its seat share from 3 seats to 75 or 80. So that's a massive increase. So the future is uncertain for all the reasons that our panelists have suggested. It's a shame that Dimitry couldn't stay with us, but I think the understandings of citizenship in terms of not only the inclusions, but also the exclusions are going to sadly, become more and more stark. And it's a struggle that those of us who care about justice and humanity, will have to face. So I'm sorry to have to end on such a sober note, but I think that's the material that we have before us. Thank you, Pamela. Thank you, Harsh. Thank you, Dimitry. I know you're not here, but if you do catch up on the recording, and of course, thank you, Ritu and colleagues, for convening this wonderful set of events and for convening this panel on what is a topical issue and on which I suspect we will continue having conversations. So I'd like to hand back to Ritu in case, Ritu, you have any overall comments to make, but my job here is done. Thanks so much. Thank you.
Yes, keeping in mind that we are running late again for the next session, I would thank all of you, and thanks a lot, Indrajit, for moderating this panel, and thank you everyone for coming. The process of the People Summit, the aim of the People Summit is to take the learnings from here and draw a people's roadmap for the European Parliament, on which we want the engagement of the European Parliament with India. So it is beyond the idea of what we are discussing already, perhaps in our country, but also have a transnational responsibility towards human rights and the human cost, which Harsh so soberly mentioned towards the end of this conversation. So I thank you all, and Indrajit, I will be in touch with you and also with the rest of the speakers for the interventions that we are planning to make in the coming future. Thank you.
Take care, everyone. Stay safe.
Yes.
You too.